It's Monday, the 28th of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Craig McKinley, Shadow Levelling Up Secretary Lisa Nandy, Andrew Fisher, former Director of Policy for the Labour Party, and Madeline Grant from the Daily Telegraph. Today,
what we've got at the minute is effectively an entire ban on onshore wind, which is the cheapest form of electricity production.
Both the Prime Minister and myself have always said with onshore wind, it needs to be done with local consent.
Are Tory MPs about to force Rishi Sunak to change his mind about onshore wind? Last week, Keir Starmer said this about immigration.
Our common goal must be to help the British economy off its immigration dependency.
Now the Labour leader says EU free movement is a red line. So why did he campaign for it in the past?
There is a vision for the future of this country in which we unite our amazing country and level up.
That was 3 years ago, but are politicians today really committed to levelling up?
Politicians as a whole, you know, we don't come across as human enough, and this is probably the most sort of extreme way of just showing who you are.
Matt Hancock's time in the jungle is over, but does he have a future in politics? Now, for those of you who haven't been following closely, I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Last night was the final, and the former Lioness, Jill Scott, won the contest, with the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, coming in a respectable third. Let's have a look at how the papers have been covering it. This is the front page of the Mirror. From jungle to UK storm, now get him out of here. The arrow pointing to the Houses of Parliament. He had the whip removed for appearing in the show and was criticised for abandoning his day job. But this is what The Sun has on the front page. Exclusive: Hancock cashes in. I'm a celeb. Now get me out of politics. This is reporting that he is going to pursue a showbiz career, perhaps more reality TV. That has been denied by a spokesman for Hancock, who says he wants to come back and serve his constituents. Let's have a listen to Matt Hancock himself about why he did it in the first place.
I just wanted, I mean, I've said this in there, but I just wanted to show what I'm just like as a person. People have, you know, lots of people come to me with preconceived ideas for obvious reasons, and I just wanted to be myself. But I also actually strongly believe that for politicians as a whole. You know, we don't come across as human enough, and this is probably the most sort of extreme way of just showing who you are. Sure.
Well, we always like MPs to show who they are on this programme and your human side. Craig McKinley, should the Tories boot Matt Hancock out of the party? He is meeting with Conservative Party chiefs, I think, later this week, because he'll have returned to London. Should they kick him out?
I wasn't surprised that they suspended him. We've got a fairly key date, not a private date at all, of the 5th of December, where all Conservative MPs are being asked, do you want to continue?
Do you?
On the back of, I most certainly do, on the back of boundary changes. So if he doesn't have the whip restored before the 5th, don't quite know where that leaves him. But I think it was unwise for him to do what he's done. I mean, he's come across as very human, and I don't think that does any harm, actually, to the political classes, which can be seen as somewhat aloof and detached.
So you don't think they should take the step of actually kicking him out the party?
I think in the fullness of time he'd get the whip back, as most people do. But is now the time? I think that's up to his electors to actually have a bit of a big say in this decision, frankly. It's not something I would have done.
You may have watched some of the programme, Lisa, perhaps to see how human Matt Hancock came across.
I wasn't voting for him.
Thanks for putting that on the record. Should the Tories boot him out or not?
I mean, it's got to be up to them in the end, but I think he's come across as a complete plonker, to be honest. I mean, you've got a situation where we're going into winter with people not knowing how they're going to put food on the table, 1 million people on NHS waiting lists. If he's anything like me, he will be absolutely overwhelmed with requests for help at the moment. Parliament's sitting, he should be at work, and whatever the Tory party decides to do, he's going to have to account for himself to his constituents.
What do you think, Andrew? I mean, he said he wanted to show his human side, and clearly the public liked him to some extent because they didn't boot him out until the final, in the final three, and he wanted to raise issues like his dyslexia campaign. Should the Conservatives kick him out?
Well, I think probably the public voted to keep him in so he could keep eating various bits
That
of
may be
kangaroo
true.
genitals
That
or
may be
whatever
true.
else. But I don't think it does. Look, I don't think MPs should have second... You know, there's a serious issue here, which is I don't think MPs should have second jobs. They've got a job. It's very well paid. It puts them in the top 5% of earners. They don't need secondary or tertiary income. And actually, there are dozens of MPs across Parliament who spend some of their week, every week, doing other jobs for their own benefit. And that's not good enough. And actually, all of those MPs, in my view, should be booted out of Parliament, whether they're Tory, Labour, Lib Dem, whoever.
Even if they're doctors,
I think there's a difference.
like Rosanna
I think
Allen
there's
Khan,
a difference
she's
if
doing
you have
A&E.
to maintain professional qualifications. So if you're a nurse, you have to keep up with that. If you're a firefighter, a doctor, something like that. But there's very few that do that, and they should have the right to do that. But there's a lot that are just on the boards of various institutions, getting quite well paid. Theresa May, I saw the other day, got £2 million in after-dinner speeches recently. Over the last few weeks. I think that was reported in the press. So, you know, I don't think that. Boris Johnson similarly, and there are, you know, dozens of others. I don't want to pick on those two particularly, but, you know, I think that's more of a problem.
Madeline?
Well, I wonder what would possibly propel someone to pay £2 million to hear a Theresa May after-dinner speech, but that's another point entirely. I think Andrew actually makes a really good point there. I think I perhaps take a slightly different line on second jobs generally, that I think sometimes they can really add to the experience and the multiplicity of Parliament. But I think where you have to draw the line is when it's essentially lobbying that is purely on the virtue of that person being an MP and having privileged access. I think that's quite a different kettle of fish to someone who's bringing their other skills to Parliament. As for Matt Hancock, I think ultimately it's one for the electors to decide. I think it was a very self-indulgent thing to do, and I'm very grateful that no one at work asked me to write about it, because I haven't seen a single minute of I'm a Celebrity with Matt Hancock, and I don't regret that. But I think maybe you should stick to what the precedent is, which I think is like 6 months out in the wilderness, and then you get the whip back. Let's see what happens.
We'll report it, no doubt. Let's have a look at this headline in The Times. Keir Starmer rules out a return to freedom of movement in EU. Now, this follows on from comments made by the Labour leader to the Mail on Sunday, in which he rules out a Swiss-style deal. You remember that was a headline, I think, from a week or two ago with the EU, and says freedom of movement is a red line for me. Why is he saying that, Lisa?
Well, because the situation has changed, and in order to do a much closer deal with the European Union and accept freedom of movement, we'd have to re-enter negotiations with the EU. I don't think there's anybody in the EU who wants to do that. When I was serving as Shadow Foreign Secretary under Keir for 2 years, I didn't meet a single person in Europe who would want to entertain that. And actually, I don't think most people in this country want to see us embroiled in more internal division. We've had a decade of division in this country. We've got to move forwards. We could cooperate much more closely with the European Union without having to reopen questions about Britain's membership of the European Union and freedom of movement and other divisive issues. And that's what I think we should concentrate on.
It's interesting that you say things have changed, because it was during his leadership campaign. That was only in 2020, and he actually pledged to defend free movement as we left the EU. I mean, he was pushing for freedom of movement as part of the free trade deal negotiations that were being carried out by Boris Johnson. I mean, this is completely incompatible with what he's saying now.
But I think what we all came to realise during that leadership contest, and I was in it as well, is because we spent a lot of time debating these issues with the electorate and together. And what we came to realise is this country is desperate for politicians to stop fighting the battles of the past and rehearsing old arguments and start to think about how we're going to move this country forward. I was in favour of free movement. I am still in favour of free movement. If you ally it with a strong policy of skilling up young people in this country. The problem with free movement in places like Wigan wasn't that we had nurses and doctors coming to work in our hospital. We were proud of that and we were grateful to them. It was that young people only a few streets away were looking at those jobs and thinking, I might as well try and go to the moon as to get those jobs, because we've stripped away all of the help.
But isn't there a problem
that would get them there?
But isn't there a problem with that? You say you are in favour of freedom of movement.
If you ally it with a policy that fills labour shortages in this country, first and foremost, by skilling up young people to get those jobs. And we haven't done it. We haven't done it for over a decade. The nursing bursary's gone. The education maintenance allowance has gone, tuition fees have gone up, the grants have gone. That whole architecture that would have got working class young people from my constituency there has gone. And it's not acceptable to say we'll just fill those shortages by bringing people in from overseas and ignoring young people who want to make a contribution to their own country.
Craig?
Well, all I'm hearing from Lisa, unfortunately, is a lot of confusion. As you say, a few years ago, it wasn't that long ago at all. During those Brexit war years, you had Keir Starmer, particularly as the Shadow Europe Minister, fighting every single step of the way to try and get Brexit done through Parliament. We had a stymied Parliament. It was completely moribund. And finally, we had to almost beg the Labour Party under the Fixed Term Parliament Act to allow that supermajority to allow an election.
But do you
so
welcome
they were
this, though?
fighting. They were fighting left, right and centre to continue free movement. They're now saying they're not in favour of free movement.
Well,
but let's get to the fundamentals of this, Joe. Given that we have the floor on work visas at just $26,500 as the salary, that 60% of all UK jobs are available to the world to come and apply for them. And then we can link into this rather dramatic figures we saw last week of the 504,000 net migrants.
Completely incoherent.
What I cannot understand is we have 5.3 million people on a form of benefit in the UK. 3.3 million of those are the able, not on a form of disability benefit. We have 1.3 million jobs available. There's the disconnect, and yet we have the CBI on a regular basis saying we can't fill the jobs, just let's bring more people in. Now that has an additional cost. That has a cost in housing, health, education, and all the infrastructure things that go with it. This is the debate we should be having. I agree on a point that we should be getting domestic people in work. I don't believe, and I don't think the country believes, that the Labour Party is ever going to do that, because many in your party actually believe in a universal basic income.
Although you've the one's been in power for so long, but anyway.
I'm sorry, but it's just completely incoherent. You said you were going to take back control of the borders. Net migration's just reached a record high. And as you rightly say, we've got lots of labour shortages and we've got lots of people out of work. Why have we got all those things? Because you haven't got an immigration policy and you haven't got a skills policy and you certainly haven't put them together.
We
it's
have
a
got
shambles.
an immigration policy. It's
Only 2 weeks ago,
26,500, which I think now is too low.
Only 2 weeks ago, the Higher Education Minister was bragging about the fact that we've been able to attract 600,000 foreign students to Britain 10 years early. And then we read at the weekend that apparently the government is going to crack down on the very people that 2 weeks ago they were begging to come to Britain. It's completely incoherent. It's just posturing. These are back-of-the-fag packet policies that unravel as soon as they're announced. And it's about time somebody in government started to think seriously about skills policy for Britain and a labour shortages policy that meant that we invested in our young people and filled the gaps that then existed with immigrants who come to make a contribution to this country.
We have a lot of gaps in unskilled work as well. So it's not all about skilled work. There's a lot of unskilled work that needs filling.
Totally agree, but you haven't got policy for either of these things. That's the problem. And it's causing chaos for businesses up and down the country. Can't tell you how many businesses in my constituency say to me, we could do far more, we could take far more customers if we were able to get people to come and work for us.
Well, perhaps, I know in the preamble to this, we were discussing how we might be able to work together. Perhaps it is time that politicians do work together to get people into work, rather than having this disconnect of universal basic income, rather than my perhaps more robust stance that people need to take jobs if they're available.
All right, well, let's bring the others in. Andrew, what do you make of Keir Starmer's strategy? I mean, it's very clear what he thought, and we all believed him just a few years ago at the time, and now it's a red line, freedom of movement.
Well, I think there are two different things. One is he was facing the Labour Party membership, who he knew were very liberal on this, and he said one thing, and then he looked at the electorate and went, actually, I think I need to posture over here. And that's what explains the change. Look, it's a dishonest thing. Let's be frank about it. I'm not going to pull my punches. He said we will defend free movement as we leave the EU. The minute he became leader, there was a chance to amend the bill going through Parliament. He didn't amend it to say we will defend free movement as we leave. So it's just dishonest. And I think, Lisa stood in that campaign, Rebecca Long-Bailey stood in that campaign. Disagree with them or agree with them, they were honest about what they stood for. And I think it's unfortunate that actually, if you look at most of the pledges he stood on in that campaign, he's now reneged on them entirely. But his speech at the CPI last week, where he did say we need to wean the country off immigration, is delusional. We're not going to wean the country off immigration because we need it. We need net migration.
Well, those figures certainly show that we've
got an ageing population. We've got massive shortages of nurses. We've got massive shortages of care workers. If you train up lots of British people to do those jobs, you're taking them out of the labour market and putting them somewhere else. So you're going to backfill the jobs. We have shortages in this country. We need them filled. Skills is part of it, but we're still going to need high net migration. And actually, over half of that total is students who we want to come in and study at our universities.
And there is a debate about whether they should be included in the figures. But are you saying you're relaxed about 500,000 figure in terms of net migration?
Depending on how it breaks down, yes, of course.
Well, every year?
Yes, because, you know, if universities can attract 200,000, 300,000 students every year, that's fine and good on them. You know, that's good. As long as there are still places for British kids to go to university, and there seem to be, then that's fine. But if you look at a range of things, look, the rest of that was a lot of the rest of that was the Ukraine scheme and the Hong Kong scheme, which I think we were right to do. Yeah. And actually, we haven't got safe and legal routes for people coming from the rest of the world who we don't take our fair share of either.
What did you make of Keir Starmer's stance, both at the CBI and in his article on Sunday? He is pushing this issue, isn't he?
He is, and you know, but I think Andrew makes a very fair point that there is something quite disingenuous about this, because it is, you know, quite a Damascene conversion from him from where he was very, very recently. But I guess the fact is that when you're up against the current state of affairs where things just appear so chaotic, and I think that it's certainly true that that 500,000 figure is abnormally and unnaturally high this year for all the reasons that Andrew described. I just don't think that, even so, I don't think that there'll be that kind of mitigating sentiment amongst the public, because it just comes at a time when the government appears to have lost control of a range of different issues. It comes at the same time as the small boat crossings, which obviously is a different thing, but it feeds into that feeling of having lost control. And then you get into other stuff like policing, like the protesters on the road, all sorts of areas. So I think that it's particularly harmful that this has just come out so recently.
What do you say about Andrew Fisher calling Keir Starmer dishonest on this?
Well, look, I mean, he rightly says I was in that leadership contest. I think we all put forward the platform that we believed in and we stood on that. But I also think that Keir is the sort of politician who listens. I didn't know him that well before we went into the leadership contest. I knew him a bit, but I hadn't been on the front bench for some time. But I've worked with him pretty closely over the last few years. And one of the things that is a feature of this shadow cabinet is that he's put in some very strong-minded people, some very strong women, into some of the top jobs, and when they put forward views, he listens and he will change his mind, and I think that is a positive thing in a politician.
Andrew?
Well, look, Elise is of course not going to say that the leader of her party who's pointed to the shadow cabinet is
she's
dishonest.
going to defend him in the way that she has. Yeah. So what do you say to that? I mean, is it sincerely held in that sense, and he is listening, and there has been a change?
No, I don't think it is. I think he came in knowing what he had to say to win the Labour Party leadership and was very ruthless about doing so.
And perhaps win the next election?
Look, I think that's probably got more to do with the implosion of Boris Johnson and Partygate and Liz Truss than it has to Keir's wonderful charisma. But look, if he does win the next election, he's 20 points ahead, Labour's in a strong position, I hope Labour does win the next election, then great. You know, but I don't think he necessarily needs to have moved on some of the policies he has moved on in order to do so.
I think the fact that we've been out this week, you know, talking about some of these issues and trying to address some very real concerns out there in the country, the speech was made at the CBI deliberately because we believe that immigration can be a very positive thing for the country. My dad's an immigrant to Britain, but you've got to invest in young people here as well. The next Labour government will do it. We've set out how we're going to devolve skills policy in order to make sure that young people can be skilled up for the jobs that actually exist in communities, and then fill those labour shortages with immigration. And we were addressing a very real concern from business that there are these huge gaps in the labour market at the moment. And when you add that to a paper-thin Brexit deal and the impact of the pandemic, you've got serious problems for businesses trying to trade at the moment and trying to do well.
And did you agree then with the sentiment, weaning off Britain's dependency, as he put it? I'll come back to the issue of language, whether that is negative, but dependency on immigration. You agree with Keir Starmer?
I do agree with that, but
right.
I mean, what he's promoting is politically shameless. He's got his eye on the red wall seats, seats like yours.
Oh, well, politicians
Lisa,
being shameless.
Well, I don't do that. I tend to stick to a policy once I've declared it, but it seems he's willing to flip-flop whatever his red wallers think that he needs to do to get those seats back.
It's pretty
and
extraordinary.
I'm afraid I do not believe a word of it.
Conservative MP to accuse us of being all over the place.
Let's look at the immigration, some of the immigration issues on migration.
You crashed the economy in 44 days.
You've opposed Rwanda completely. You oppose every policy we have to try and stiffen up our immigration policy. You're against the Borders Nationality Bill. You've been against everything we've ever tried to do to mitigate migration, every single time. And if you now try to be believed that you're the party to be tougher on immigration, I don't think it's going to work.
I'm sorry, this really is just nonsense, though, because you accuse
You
us
want to
of
be tough on immigration?
You accuse us of being tough on immigration, but the points-based system that you have is a points-based system that we introduced in order to ensure that we had a grip on the immigration system and that we could welcome people here to make a contribution, but we weren't displacing other people from the labour market. And instead, what you've presided over is just a series of chaos. You say we oppose your policies. You're opposing your own policies. You've got a higher education minister who is saying one thing and a Home Secretary is saying another about foreign students. It's just absurd.
Based system if we stayed in the EU.
Yeah, but Craig, would you agree?
We introduced it while we were in the EU.
How would you describe the government's success over controlling its borders as it said it would do and having a record high net migration figure of 504,000?
Well, as we've described, there are some oddities in there. Let's hope they're a one-off oddity. You've got the Afghan scheme, the Ukraine scheme, and the British national overseas passport holders in Hong Kong. That's 188,000. So there's that going on.
Yeah.
And generally, I'm in favour of students because that is a good British export. But when you've got the policy where dependents are allowed to come in as well, quite uniquely, I don't know what the rules are in the US, but if I decided to do a course of study in the US, I'm not entirely sure I'd be allowed to take any number of dependents in.
No,
there are some exploitations going on here that are obviously anomalous. They do not make sense, and we've got to do something about it. But of course,
12 years.
But of
I mean,
course,
if you wanted to do something about it, wouldn't you have done it by now?
the channel migrants on dinghies, I mean, let's put that into some context. Years ago, we were probably having similar numbers on the back of a lorry and we knew nothing about them.
That's true. Those routes have been closed off.
The difference is it is very, very visible.
These are promises set up by your own government. I'm not making a judgment about it, but these are the metrics that they have set themselves and they've clearly failed. Is there any difference, Madeleine, or much difference between what Labour and the government are proposing when it comes to migration, immigration, apart from the Rwanda policy?
Well, I read this piece that Yvette Cooper wrote for, I think, The Times a couple of weeks back, and the title of the piece was something like How Labour Would Solve the Channel Migrant Crisis or something. So I clicked on it expecting to see some solutions, and it was just the most platitudinous, vague, they're very low on specific policies. Some of it was just things like, we will make the Home Office function better. Great. I imagine it's not that easy. There have been serious problems with the Home Office for some time. And I think that right now being in opposition is a very cushy gig because you can point to the chaos and say, look what happened, we can do better. But as you get closer to the election, I think people do want to hear more in the way of specifics. And something more substantial than we're going to hire some agents to crack down on the gangs or a few more people in the Home Office.
I mean, in terms of the language, I said I would return to it. Diane Abbott, Labour MP on Newscast, said that this was the speech to the CBI about weaning the British economy off its immigration dependency, was dog whistle politics that sounded like the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. Do you agree?
I think she's right that it's dog whistle. It's trying to say, look, we're going to be tough. And actually, when Lisa explained it, she said, look, we are going to still need lots of immigration because we are going to have these shortages within the economy. And you can't train people overnight. We've got, I think, 40,000 nurse shortages. Even if we put more resources into that now, that's another 2 years before you've got a fully trained nurse. 2 or 3 years. So you're not going to close these overnight. You are going to need more migration. So pretending you're not is, I'm afraid, just signalling, oh, we're tough on migration too. And that is, I'm afraid, platitudinous, as Madeleine said.
I think that the language was designed to show exactly that. Last year when there was a petrol crisis, there was cross-party consensus that we had a shortage of HGV drivers that was contributing to the crisis and that we needed a temporary solution.
And Keir Starmer was asked if he would agree to 100,000 visas and he said yes.
Well, because we needed a temporary solution. It's exactly what Andrew just described. And so saying he didn't go out and say we're going to end all immigration to the UK overnight and crash the economy. He said we need a longer-term settlement so that we are investing in young people in Britain and the skills of our people first.
Is it dog whistle politics, though, to talk
No,
like
because that exact same sentiment is found in every European country. When I was Shadow Foreign Secretary, I spent time in Austria, in Germany, in France, where the same concerns were being raised about free movement being used as an excuse not to invest in your own people.
Without saying wean off, which makes it sound like you're on drugs, which is a bad thing, a dependency. Again, it's this language, and I'm afraid some of Yvette Cooper's language around this has been very cold and insensitive. The Channel migrant crisis is because there aren't safe and legal routes. You know, Suella Braverman was exposed terribly at the Home Affairs Select Committee, to be fair, by one of your colleagues.
But Yvette Cooper has been saying this repeatedly.
you know,
She's been at the dispatch box every week saying there are no safe and legal routes, this is inhumane and it's wrong,
and that's why
and it
people are
benefits
crossing
the
the
people
channel.
traffickers.
Listen,
And in that article that you talked about, she talked about not just about beefing up the capacity to be able to do that and crack down on those people traffickers, which is really important. I used to work with children who've been trafficked.
But should
they're victims in all of this.
Is that the right language that you would be comfortable with
She also
using?
talked about cooperating more with the French, ending this needlessly antagonistic relationship, because
Which
that
I
is
think
one
is
of the
already
reasons
happening
why we've got
under Rishi
an
Sunak,
enormous
to be
problem.
fair. There does seem to have been a bit of a rapprochement with France. I think it's fair to
I mean,
say.
we always
Yes.
say the safe and
It's
legal
not that
routes.
easy.
But it's,
You know as
the
I do.
relationship is in a desperate state after the last
Lisa,
decade.
you know as well as I do, there are probably 80 million displaced people because of crisis around the world at the moment. There are many more hundreds of millions that would probably rather be here or in a Western country rather than where they are. I asked one of your colleagues last time I sat here a few months ago, what is the right number for Britain? You tell me what the right number is.
Well,
is it 1 million a year?
Well,
10 million?
Here you go. You want a bit.
Is it 50 million? You tell me what the number
Can I
is.
answer your question? You asked for a bit of cross-party consensus earlier. I agree with Rishi Sunak on this. David Cameron set arbitrary targets for Britain for years when he was Prime Minister, and he didn't meet a single one of them. We want to make sure...
Don't you think it's sensible that we say, yeah, we can accommodate that because we can then do the infrastructure, the housing, the schooling within a managed process?
No, you know what I think would be sensible? I think it would be sensible to have a managed process, and you don't have one at the moment. What you've got is chaos. One of the solutions to the problem that you rightly identified is that there are many, many people in refugee camps in countries neighbouring conflict at the moment, and they've been stuck there for years. I used to work with them. It's appalling what is happening to those people. We should be setting up schemes, Andrew talked about safe and legal routes, to be able, in partnership with other countries, so that we can all
You won't ask the number
take
of numbers. Andrew,
our fair
what's your
share.
right number?
Well, look, you talk
What
about...
is the right number,
Well,
please?
actually,
I'll
Andrew's
tell
already
you.
said
It's a pretty
500,000's
simple
OK.
question.
What's
I'm
your
happy to
number?
answer
Is it 80 million?
But, Craig, what's your number?
Well, I think the fundamental is we should not be accepting people who are coming from
But hang on, what's your
from
number?
a safe
You've just put
country.
that down.
That's
Well,
nonsense.
We're
That is
struggling.
nonsense. I'm
We've
sorry.
struggled
Hang on,
this
I'll come
year.
back to that, but
We've
I want
struggled
to-
this year with 188,000 of what we would call the very
right.
genuine cases. We're struggling with
We
that
haven't got a
number.
number.
OK, so
And
you
I
want
know
to go
that
back to tens of thousands?
my email inbox is full of local people in South Thanet looking for accommodation, trying to get
yet
into
there are
doctors.
labour shortages
and there are
all over the
shortages.
place. I mean, it's just so
So
you wanted
to
to come
add
back
more
on the...
is not
Let me
going
just
to
let
work.
Andrew have
Sorry,
a final...
this nonsense that these are people coming from safe countries. Are you saying the only people we can take seeking asylum are from Ireland, France, Iceland, Norway? I mean, because they're the only countries that neighbour us.
I'm saying
You know,
if you
no,
pass
that's what you
through-
said.
if you pass
well,
through
how
a
else are you
safe
going to
country?
get here? How else are you going to get here? If you come from Afghanistan,
my
which is not...
interpretation-
Do you think Afghanistan's a safe country?
No, it's not.
Right, so how would you
my
get here?
interpretation of
There's
the
no-
UN
there's no-
1951
well,
There is
Convention
a safe and legal
anymore.
route from there.
It was not a shopping cart to
not
go
up and
where you
running.
like. It was
Not
to
anymore, it's
find
closed.
somewhere safe.
What about Syria?
And if you're in France, you are
Right, so France should take everyone and we should take no one.
Safe.
That's your line.
I'm going to end.
That's nonsense,
I'm just going
and
to
you
end it
know
here,
it.
but I want to go back just briefly to freedom of movement, because people may be still confused by you saying you're in favour of freedom of movement, but only if it's aligned with skills.
No, in principle, but we've been very clear. We're not returning to freedom of movement. We're not going to seek a Swiss-style deal with the EU.
Unless it's
we are
aligned
going to
with
seek.
skills.
We are going to. No, we're not
Here.
in favour of freedom of movement. We've just spent the entire programme discussing how, with people attacking Keir Starmer for saying freedom of movement is a red line. It's a red line. We couldn't have been clearer about that.
Right. We'll end it there. Let's talk about this headline in the Sunday Telegraph. This is Gove, Michael Gove, fuels Tory revolt as he backs onshore wind farms. Now, this is a mounting rebellion within the Conservative Party against the continuation of the effective ban on onshore wind farms, new ones being built, contained in the Levelling Up Bill. An amendment by former Minister Simon Clarke to lift the ban on them has Labour support and a reasonable number of Conservative MPs. It could provide the numbers to defeat the government. Now, just to remind you that this effective ban on building onshore wind farms was brought in 2015 under David Cameron. We can show you a flavour of some of the protests at the time, public pressure that was building up to him banning it here in Wales, first of all. Bristol and in Cornwall led to the coalition government taking that effect. So very few new wind turbines have been built since then in England, many more in Scotland. There's reportedly a cabinet split now over whether or not that ban should be lifted. Craig, should it be lifted?
I'm very much in favour of localism. I think fundamentally the whole wind ambition is nonsensical. We've got most wind turbine manufacturers across Europe are currently going bankrupt. I'm rather concerned with jumping out of Putin's frying pan into President Xi's fire. Because a lot of these turbines and all the manufactured bits are increasingly coming from China. And we're told this total fundamental lie that this is the cheapest form of energy.
Well,
it is not. It is not.
What is the cheapest form?
It is when the wind is blowing, but we've got the most ludicrous contracts that says we will pay you, wind companies, when the wind is blowing, and when it doesn't, it's someone else's problem.
Right, so
we should be having
I
contracts
understand your
that
argument,
are 24/7,
but clearly,
365.
would you support lifting the ban? The effective ban that means it's very, very, very hard to build onshore wind farms.
We've effectively banned fracking, despite and not even testing if there's local support, with a nice little dividend of cash.
And on wind farms?
But I'm in agreement with fracking, as you know, if there is local support. So if you're not going to allow that, because Whitehall knows best, how can we then have wind farms, yes,
Lisa?
Because Whitehall knows best, despite what local people might want.
Lisa, why should the ban be lifted?
I'm so confused by all of this. It seems to be about 8 different positions in the Tory party at the moment on one fairly simple amendment. I think the ban should be lifted because in 2015, as Andrew will well remember, the government brought in an incredibly restrictive framework around which decisions could be made about onshore wind. No other infrastructure is subject to this framework. And effectively what Simon Clarke is doing is giving the power back to local authorities in order to make those decisions, who will be responsive to their communities and have to listen to objections in the same way as you would anywhere else.
So what happens if they do object? We may not get many more onshore wind farms.
If they object, but just on Friday night, I was in Leigh and somebody at a public meeting stood up and said, why is it so hard to get renewables here? So it gives the power back to communities. And I do actually agree with Craig on one thing. I'm in favour of localism. I think people have to drive decisions. And I think when you ask people to drive decisions, they tend to make the right decisions. Renewables are cheaper. Wind turbines create good jobs. And they provide cheaper energy. And people want to be able to make a contribution to climate change.
Right.
And it's a nonsense that effectively we're banning them from doing that at the moment.
Madeline?
Well, I like the idea of localism, but I think in practice we're a very hostile to building anything country. We're a country of NIMBYs. I wish that was not the case. I think perhaps they need to think about ways of bringing communities on side, perhaps by doing what they do in Germany, where if you're near a wind farm, then you get to have some money off your bills, something like that. But on the whole, we seem to be very resistant to building anything anywhere, and I kind of despair for that reason. I mean, I sort of agree with Craig. I think wind could be a useful part of the energy mix. It's not the great panacea that it's often portrayed as, and it has to be backed up by fossil fuels. So I think that it's a nice thing. But if we are going to expend political capital building new things, I'd rather it was something like nuclear. I think there's greater gains to be had. But of course, I don't think the government should be standing in the way of building wind turbines if there's local consent.
I mean, if it is lifted, the ban, it is true, I think, local people would still be able to object. And that would mean that we probably wouldn't get many more. We might get some, but we wouldn't get many more. Ed Miliband, Lisa's colleague, has said he would actually like to go further than just lifting the ban. Would that mean overriding any local opposition or saying it would be mandatory?
Well, it could do. I don't know exactly what Ed Miliband had in mind, and I'm sure Lisa's keen to clarify. But on the generalities of this, you can't object to living next to a nuclear reactor. If you build a main road, a motorway, you can't object. There's no localism. I don't want that being built there. Your house can be compulsorily purchased. HS2, I personally am in favour of it, but there's no localism in that. Local communities go, no, I don't want it going through my bit of land. So we are very pick and choose about this.
Yes.
And I think that's dishonest. So
HS2 and making it take.
Well, that's due to government incompetence, I think, more than anything else.
And quite a lot of local
private
opposition
sector incompetence as well in building it. But look, I think we need a consistent framework. Look, if we want cheaper energy, if we want energy security, we need more renewables as part of the mix. We need some more nuclear as well.
And what about shale?
No, because it's
So you
polluting.
want to
We're trying
import it from Qatar for the next 30 years? Or
No,
what do you
I
fancy?
don't. No, I think we need to wean ourselves off it, as I said. So
Wean is fine, but it's going to be with us for quite some time.
That word again.
I mean, so should
wean.
local people...
about energy, not human beings. That's the difference.
Should
We need
local
energy to
people
live, it's
have the
quite-
right to object, or should there actually be...
Of course, local people should have the right to object, and we've never suggested that they shouldn't. What Ed Miliband was talking
what
about...
did he mean when he said
was
go further?
speeding up decisions on renewables
Right.
and on onshore wind, because at present it takes years, it should take months. He was talking about having a target to try and get more of these built across the country. I actually have a much less dim view about the public than the one that this debate has reflected, because I think that people are generally in favour of things like affordable housing schemes, in favour of renewables projects
But not
in their
always where they
communities.
live.
No, I don't think that's right, actually. Where you run into problems is where those schemes don't necessarily benefit the community. If you're building luxury housing in a town like mine, where people earn on average about 20 grand a year, and their kids can't get those houses, people will object. If you're building genuinely affordable housing, they'll be all in favour.
And wind farms, would they agree to that?
And actually, you know, I think Madeleine made a really good point there about communities needing to benefit from these decisions. In fact, good Labour councils all over the country are currently doing exactly that. They're building clean energy schemes and they're using them to plough resources back into the local community. And there's strong public support for that.
All right, we're going to talk about levelling up. Or did you want to say it brief?
I just wanted to say that, well, I think that sometimes the incentives are... Actually, it's not people being irrational when they object to new housing. You know, people who already own a house, they might say, if this spoils my view, it brings down the value of my house. It's one of those things where at the national level, there's endless good things that come from it. But sometimes at a local level, there is some incentive to do it. So it's often people behaving rationally. I wish that wasn't the case. But I think sometimes it's not necessarily a kind of pure hostility. It's partly self-interest.
Let's talk about more levelling up. Daily Mirror. Labour say Tory levelling up promises in tatters as £576 million, very precise, of funding value lost. Lisa, you've just written a book called All In, How We Build a Country That Works. And you say in it, All In is about the country we could be if we handed power and resources to people in every part of the UK. What does that mean?
That was a very nice segue from the last conversation. Well done.
We've thought about these things. We've thought about these things, you'll be pleased to know.
Well, it basically means that in the 12 years that I've been the MP for Wigan, what I've seen far too often is people who have a stake in the outcome and skin in the game, building and creating and coming together to protect and preserve everything of value in our community, whether it's a local football club that was under threat, or good jobs for young people, or community centres. And at every turn, they've been thwarted by a system that should pull in behind them, but too often comes up against them like a buffer. I think if we handed them power and resources and tilted the balance of power back in their favour...
And how much are we talking about resources?
We
I
could
mean,
build a
gave that
country that
figure
works.
£576 million. Presumably, you would restore that £576 million because you say, or it says in the article, it's been eaten up by inflation.
Yes, so the issue with the levelling up funds isn't just that they've had £576 million of the value wiped off them since the Tories crashed the economy. It's that they were piecemeal little grants handed out Hunger Games style from junior ministers and civil servants in Westminster and Whitehall who'd never set foot in those communities.
Right.
That often don't even begin to align with local priorities.
So you would increase that fund?
No, I think we should devolve powers and funding to metro mayors, councils and communities across the country so they can build a country that works.
You want to obviously secure projects, no doubt.
I have got a very good project in Ramsgate, £20 million.
Right.
The first
Do you think
round
the government
levelling
still
up.
has committed to the idea and the funding of levelling up?
I'm sure they are, but we have got a tough financial settlement in the UK. Now, the thought under, sounds like Lisa's plans, that the local councillors would be doing the cherry picking of what are going to be winners or not, I'm afraid fills me with dread. I'm more market driven. There is a world of global capital out there, a lot of it looking for a home. I rather we had a more benign tax economy that actually encouraged that type of investment in Wigan, Ramsgate and everywhere else.
Well, Craig, you'll be delighted
but
to know
top-down
then
telling
that
people what they will do, I'm afraid never really sits well with me.
That part of the argument in the book is that people in their communities, whether they're business people, whether they're local politicians, whether they're part of our workforce, they understand the assets and the strengths in their communities. And they have a much stronger sense of how to come together in order to create a system that works. So rather than having this top-down system where we, in one of the most centralised countries in the world, where we dictate from the centre what you should be doing in Grimsby, the people of Grimsby were only too well aware 20 years ago that they needed to invest in the wind industry. And look at where it's got us. It's got us good jobs, it's got us money back into the community. You've got young people from one of the most deprived estates in the country powering us through the future. You can't do all of that from Westminster and Whitehall, and I think we should build partnerships to change that.
I agree with that, but it sounds like you need to rename your book A Good Dollop of Socialism.
Oh, well, there's a title. There's a title, postscript.
Well, I proudly would. I'll send you a copy.
Can I just go back there? You saw Boris Johnson in the headlines with his ambition and commitment to the idea of levelling up and a levelling up fund. I'm just going to play, again, a clip from Rishi Sunak during the leadership campaign in the summer when he was talking to Tory members in Tunbridge Wells. Let's have a look.
I managed to start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas. Then that needed to be undone. I started the work of undoing that.
Are you sure Rishi Sunak's really committed to levelling up and not undoing, as he said, the commitments as promised?
Well, he was in Tunbridge Wells. I've got family live in Tunbridge Wells. And if you think all of Tunbridge Wells is a land of milk and honey, no, it's not. It's not. But it should be fairly spread. I'm more in favour of bigger infrastructure projects that actually connect this country together. I think what Madeleine said earlier on about how slow things are, we've been having a debate in Kent about the Lower Thames crossing for about 10 years. It's still not turned one bit of soil. We're no closer now than we were 10 years ago. If it were China, I'm glad we're not, but if it were China, they'd have built 10.
Right.
So we have a lot of these problems going on because of sloth in the planning system.
And I mean, you've explained that, and you said so too, Madeleine, but broadly, who decides on priority areas? Tunbridge Wells and Kent just as deserving, poor parts, as big metropolitan areas or towns like Wigan?
Look, I mean, that clip from Rishi Sunak was atrocious. He was standing in
He said he was taking it to rural areas that are also...
Yeah, I'm sorry, and he didn't. He was standing in a leafy garden saying, bragging about bringing money from poorer
That's what they
areas,
say. All I'm doing is putting that out there. I mean, who decides the priority areas? There are poorer parts of areas that you would consider normally well off.
There are. But look, I think it has to be based on need. But look, I live in Croydon, where the council's just gone bankrupt for the third time, this time under a Tory mayor. And, you know, our funding is it's a Tory council, actually, Tory-controlled. But if our funding was the same as neighbouring Lambeth, our community would have an extra £65 million a year in it, and we wouldn't have gone bankrupt any time, let alone 3. So, you know, levelling up isn't just about the rest of the country as well. There are huge pockets of deprivation in London where funding is deeply unfair, even within the settlement we've got now.
Part of the reason for that is because we've created a situation where we've written off the contribution of most people and most parts of Britain. And by doing so, we've crammed more and more people into a few major cities. And you see the costs of that. You'll see it every day in Croydon.
Levelling up, do you think it's ever going to become a reality? I mean, if we take it as initially sort of outlined, this divide between particularly north and south?
Well, I mean, actually, the north-south divide is real, but most of that is actually London. Once you take London out of the equation, it can give you quite a misleading picture, because once you take away London, there's often real parity.
And huge divides within London as well.
Oh, yeah, of course. And you know, I grew up in the countryside and in a prosperous area, but there were pockets of rural poverty near where I grew up that were very, very real. So I think it's wrong to dismiss that and act like, you know, sending more money to rural areas is pure opportunism and naked ambition. But I think that the thing we could do most of all is to take a look at the planning system that chokes all development, all infrastructure projects and all of that. And it may mean going back and tweaking stuff that dates back to the time of Clement Attlee, but I think we have to do it because it's been holding this country back ever since.
Do you think a Labour government would level up?
I think it would do so more than the Tories. I mean, look, we've had various slogans over the years, haven't we? We had Northern Powerhouse, and they've just cancelled the rail scheme that was the centrepiece of it. We've had the Midlands Engine, that didn't materialise into anything. Now we've got levelling up, and actually you see it's sort of falling apart, and there aren't many of these schemes up and running, and what there is very small beer, and actually they've taken more funding away from councils than they're putting into these.
That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me today on Monday. I'll be back tomorrow at the normal time, so I can remember at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on BBC iPlayer.